all the way through. They split the Confederacy in half. And the Confederate government was bankrupt. Who's the Confederate president? Do you remember what his name? Jefferson Davis. Even though things were bleak, he ordered his rebel soldiers to fight until they could fight no more. He was not ready to give up in any way, shape, or form. Which takes us to our next subtopic, which is the surrender of both Petersburg and Richmond, located in what state? Virginia. So what has happened here? Is Sherman sweeping the South? Is Grant leading forces in Virginia? And pretty soon the end's going to come. Okay? And this starts with the surrender of Petersburg and Richmond. So as Sherman is marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south, Confederate General Lee, who's fighting Grant in Virginia, his troops are getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And what happens in early April of 1865, Union General Philip Sheridan, who you'll hear more about in the Indian Wars, begins his assault on Petersburg. And Lee doesn't even engage him because he's low on food and soldiers, so he simply abandons Petersburg in early April of 1865. They don't even have a fight. He doesn't even fight against Philip Sheridan because he doesn't have the manpower nor the food to feed his soldiers to fight. So he simply has to abandon Petersburg. Guess what he surrenders just a few days later? Richmond. And before they leave Richmond, he orders his soldiers to set fire to anything they believed the Union would want or could use. So, this is sad. We're done here. Lee is in retreat. He has no food. He has very few soldiers. He abandons and surrenders basically Petersburg. He abandons and basically surrenders Richmond. And he orders his soldiers to burn anything that he thought the Union would either want or could use. So after, kids, 4 long years of fighting, the Union had finally captured the Confederate capital of Richmond. It took them 4 years to do it. What was the main reason they were able to? Lack of Confederate soldiers. Population came to the end. All right, that'll take us to another subtopic, the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Does anybody have any questions over anything we talked about, anything you missed, you want to hear again? The Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Yeah, my dear? Yes, we can. So what happened here is Union General Sherman was marching closer and closer to Richmond from the south. Confederate General Lee's soldiers were getting thinner and thinner. Union General Philip Sheridan and his army were chasing Lee. Lee is so low on food and soldiers that he's forced to abandon and surrender Petersburg in early April of 1865. A few days later, under the same circumstances, Lee is forced to surrender Richmond. He orders his soldiers to set fire to anything in Richmond they believed the Union would either want or could use. And after 4 long years of fighting, the Union has finally captured the Confederate capital, which will lead us to the Confederate surrender at Appomattox. Well, this is kind of a little bit of a timeline. On April 7th of 1865, April 7th of 1865, this very important subtopic, General Grant officially asked General Lee to surrender. On April 7th of 1865, Union General Ulysses S. Grant asks Confederate General Robert E. Lee to surrender. April 7th. 2 days later, 2 days after thinking and preparing himself, on April 9th of 1865, General Lee agrees to General Grant's term of surrender. 2 days later, after thinking it over and preparing for a surrender, General Lee agrees to the terms given to him by General Grant. And the two great Civil War generals meet at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, which is a town, on April 9th, 1865. So after Lee accepts Grant's terms of surrender on April 9th, 1865, the two great Civil War generals agree to meet at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Listen to the contrast between the two great Civil War generals as far as their dress. Lee arrives in full dress uniform with a jewel-studded sword at his side, which means the handle of the sword is very fancy, would not probably be used in battle, would be more of a memento, keepsake, etc. And it was jeweled, it was decorated jewels, you know, precious stones. He's looking very good. He's in full dress uniform with a jewel-studded sword at his side. Grant, on the other hand, wore a private's shirt, unbuttoned at the neck, and showed up with muddy boots. I don't know, he just wasn't a fancy dresser. You wouldn't think he would do that, but he did. So he ends up showing up with a private shirt, not a general shirt, but a shirt a private would wear. It was unbuttoned at the top, and he showed up with muddy boots. Grant's military secretary, Eli Samuel Parker, who's on your ID sheet, drafted the terms of surrender, which it means what does he mean? He drafted. Wrote it up. Now, when you draft something, the two generals would more than likely look it over, and then officially, when it's signed, it goes from a draft to an official document. But it was Grant's military secretary, Eli Samuel Parker, who drafted the terms of surrender. And here were the terms of surrender. They were fairly simple and fairly honorable. So here's the three things that the terms of surrender made up. Again, very important you get this. First of all, the Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. So the first term of surrender was that the defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. Now, Mr. Salzman, remind me to mention the outlaw Josie Wales when we get done with this. The second thing the terms of surrender stated is that Confederate soldiers had to surrender their weapons, rifles, pistols, knives, any weapon that a Confederate soldier had in their possession owned had to be turned over to the Union. The Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. And the third term of surrender is the Confederate officers would be allowed to keep their pistols and their swords. So the terms of surrender were pretty simple, pretty honorable. Number one, the defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. Number two, the Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons. And number three, General Grant allowed the Confederate officers to keep both their pistols and swords. All Confederates, this was not in the agreement, but this is what Grant decided, all Confederates who owned a horse or a mule were allowed to keep them. As General Grant said, let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their farms. So he allowed every Confederate who owned a horse or a mule, because some rode mules, horses were scarce at times, he allowed them to keep their horse or mule to take back to the farm and use, if that's what they were going to do. After these terms were announced by Eli Samuel Parker and agreed to, a very proud General Lee surrendered officially to General Grant, ending on paper the Great Civil War. So after the terms were announced by Eli Samuel Parker and agreed upon by both sides, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. When the meeting ended, General Lee mounted his horse Traveler and rode off. When the meeting ended, General Lee mounted his horse Traveler and rode off. Now, if you were Union troops standing there witnessing that, what might be your reaction once he rode off? What's that? No, they weren't that. They were very honorable. But what would you do after you win a basketball game or a football game or whatever? What do you do after? To celebrate and cheer. They were cheering. As soon as he rode off, Union soldiers began to cheer, but General Grant ordered them to be silent in respect for the departing Robert E. Lee. So as soon as Lee got on his horse and began to depart, Union soldiers began to cheer. Grant stopped them and ordered them to be silent. Another example of his kindness towards Lee after surrender is just because they signed that, did everybody in the world know that the thing was over? No. So in the background, Union cannon fire. You can hear Union cannon fire. They're still fighting. And Grant says, "Tell them to stop that racket. The Southerners have surrendered. I see no reason to embarrass them further." So he stopped all cannon fire because he wanted to show respect that this thing was over.
But then he mocked him right after. He said, "I see no reason to embarrass them further."
Yeah, he meant embarrass him by having to surrender. It was so embarrassing for Lee to surrender. Yeah, I get what you're saying. You thought maybe the cheering. He basically stated this: it's embarrassing. This man took a lot of, it was embarrassing to surrender, so let's not embarrass him further by just, cannon fire.
So
Now,
he was being serious, not
yeah,
like sarcastic.
that's right. Now, before tomorrow we'll talk about the final effects and casualties of the Civil War. I want to talk to you about something, and I'm going to show you something tomorrow that has to do with the outlaw Josie Wales. Now, do you think that every one of these Confederates wanted to sign an oath saying they wouldn't fight against the Union? Do you think all these Confederates wanted to surrender their weapons?
Yep.
No, they didn't. Some did, but there were a lot of holdouts for a while. Just because this war ended, quote, on April 9th of 1865, the fighting didn't end for a little bit later because the word didn't get out, and some weren't ready to surrender. Many of them were what they called holdouts. Anybody seen the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales? It's all about this. It's about a guy that Clint Eastwood plays, Josie Wales, who decides he's not going to do any of these things. But the unit that he's running with after the surrender is tired of running, and they want to do this. So they march into a Union camp, and they sign their oaths, and they start to turn their weapons over. And all of a sudden, this senator who wants to punish the South for all they've done, they've got Gatling guns in the back of these wagons, and as soon as they sign their pledges and turn over their weapons, they open up these Gatling guns and kill all of these guys, these Confederates that came in to surrender late. Well, Josie Wales sees they're doing this, and he comes in and saves the day and saves a young kid. I'll show you part of it tomorrow, okay? But anyway, that was not uncommon to have a few rabble-rousers. These called rebel-rousers. That's where it came from. You ever heard of rabble-rouser? Somebody who causes trouble all the time? Well, it's these guys that didn't want to surrender. And it just so happened this Josie Wales was one of those. And then what they do after he came in and killed a few Union guys protecting his Confederate guys, they went after him. And that's what the whole Outlaw Josie Wales is about. Is about these Union soldiers that go after Josie Wales because he would not surrender and was holding out. He became kind of like this, criminal. They went after a high-stakes criminal. It's a pretty good show. Anyway, tomorrow we'll finish up this lecture. I'm going to give you another worksheet to end this up, and then I'm going to give you your first biography assignment, which you haven't done, and I'll assign you someone in the Civil War to write it. And these, I'm not going to give you a test. I'm going to give you another worksheet and the biography assignment, and we'll be done with the Civil War without a test. So, Anybody else have anything to turn in? I will correct these, and you will get another one of these sheets tomorrow. And it'll be due, and we'll move on to the next bit of information.